Hello, and thank you for joining me for another episode of the Roots Podcast. Today I want to talk about the history of Mexico and the Philippines. First of all, Mexico and the Philippines have a deep connection that goes back as far as the 1560s. We'll get back to how that started, but for now, let's talk about some of the similarities shared between the two countries. Now, if you look at the context of pre colonial Mexico and pre colonial Philippines, neither one of these parts of the world had national identities. So, in other words, in both Mexico and the Philippines, Catholicism helped to consolidate national identity. It provided the foundation for a shared sense of values across both countries. Now, in terms of language, there were some Nahuatl words, that's the language that was spoken by the Aztecs and the Tlaxcalans. There are some words from that language that are used in the Philippines. Most notably, camote, which means sweet potato. As for foods, things like tomatoes and various types of chili peppers were introduced into the Philippines from Mexico. There are national traditions, and this would go back to Catholicism, but Day of the Dead. When Mexico's celebrating Day of the Dead, from November 1st through November 2nd, the Philippines is celebrating All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, which is the traditional, holidays that are celebrated in Catholicism and that coincide with Day of the Dead. And those traditions are celebrated very similarly too. People visit grave sites, they decorate, they clean the grave sites, spend time with their deceased relatives, and reminisce with family. There's also colonial era architecture that would be recognizable to people from both countries. This would be churches, homes, administrative buildings, etc. And because Mexico and the Philippines share this tradition of Catholicism, they also have similar views around family and traditional family values. Large extended families typically gather together for holidays, etc. From a historical standpoint, from the colonial period, people in the Philippines and people in Mexico lived under very similar laws, almost the same laws. Both Mexico and the Philippines were part of Nueva España. We typically associate Nueva España with Mexico because Mexico, in the strictest sense, is the successor of Nueva España. But Nueva España also included the Philippines and also parts of the Caribbean. Well, the parts of the Caribbean that were under Spanish control. And it included Central America. So Nueva España was pretty big. One very important point of commonality between colonial Mexico and colonial Philippines was that society was broken up in two republics, Repúblicas de Españoles and Repúblicas de Indios. And if you've seen some of my previous videos, you would know that in Mexico, indigenous people lived in indigenous republics and Spanish people lived in Spanish republics. Well, that same dual system of government existed in the Philippines as well. In the context of the 14 and 1500s, when Spaniards were traveling throughout the world and meeting new people and going to new places, they didn't have proper terminology because this terminology was being developed in real time. So, they referred to people in the Americas and parts of East Asia and Southeast Asia as Indios. It didn't necessarily mean somebody from India, although India was part of that region. Indio really was a generic word for Asian, and they viewed people in the Americas as extensions of Asia. Now, as early as 1519, Spain had already sent explorers as far away as the Philippines. So when Cortez was barely arriving in Mexico, the Magellan expedition had already went around South America and across the Pacific Ocean and made its way all the way to the Philippines. Now, that expedition, which originally left from Spain, and after going around South America and going across the Pacific Ocean and reaching Asia, it later went, below Asia, and then, around Africa and all the way back to Spain. It was, one of the biggest accomplishments in world history up to that point. However, what that expedition did not discover was a way to return from Asia to the Americas. You can't create a trade route or a functioning trade route across the Pacific Ocean unless you have a way to get back across the Pacific Ocean. Because, in order to navigate the oceans, you had to travel, with the currents. And in order to come back from Asia to the Americas, you have to find currents that move in the opposite direction. That trade route was later referred to as the Manila Galleon trade route. A galleon is a type of ship, a type of vessel that was popularly used by the Spaniards at that time. Interestingly, that expedition left Jalisco. It was from Jalisco that they set sail and made their way to the Philippines. Even the boats that they built, the galleon ships, those were built with wood from the forests of Jalisco. So those ships weren't even brought from Spain. They were developed in Mexico. Even more interestingly, the crew that went on that expedition led by Legazpi, it was actually about 400 Tlaxcalan warriors and just a few dozen Spaniards. And most of those Spaniards were born in colonial Mexico. The Legazpi expedition was approved in 1564 by the government in Mexico City. And the expedition departed from the area now known as Jalisco. Interestingly, about 400 indigenous Tlaxcalan warriors took part in the expedition that went all the way to the Philippines. And there were only a few dozen Spaniards who, for the most part, many of them were born in colonial Mexico. Only a few dozen Spaniards that took part in this expedition. It was mostly indigenous Tlaxcalan warriors. Now, Manila, the capital of the Philippines, that was not fully conquered until the 1570s. And even at that point, during that conquest, Tlaxcalan warriors took part in that as well. The leader of that conquest was Juan de Salcedo, and he was the grandson of Miguel López de Legazpi. And so this conquistador, Juan de Salcedo, he was born in colonial Mexico City, and in the 1570s, when he conquered Manila, he was only about 26 years old. Now, the conquest of Manila was much different than the conquest of Tenochtitlan with the Aztecs. When the Spaniards reached Manila, Manila was already under the control of a Muslim government. Manila, at the time, it did have local rulers, but it was a satellite government of the Empire of Brunei. So at the time, the Spaniards and the Tlaxcalans were able to recruit Filipino allies who had been resisting Muslim rule. And just generally speaking, there were groups that had had differences with the government in Manila, so they banded together with the Spaniards to go and help conquer the city. And naturally, these Filipino allies were converted to Catholicism, so these were among the first Catholic converts in what is now the country Philippines. And so Manila was conquered in 1571. That's the year that the city was captured. And the Philippines overall remained part of the Spanish Empire until 1898. So that was about 327 years. And that also means that they were part of the Spanish Empire longer than Mexico and many other Latin American countries. So I think that's enough for today. I'll go into this topic in greater detail in future videos, but thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you all again next week.